Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew McDonough, and I'm a master's student in the Deer Lab at Auburn University. Today, I will be discussing my ongoing research on population level impacts of wild pigs on eastern wild turkey. Wild pigs are an introduced invasive species to North America, which can cause large amounts of damage and disruption to agriculture, infrastructure, and the ecosystems that they become established in. In regards to agriculture, this damage has been estimated to be $1.5 billion a year in the United States alone. And while we can classify agricultural and infrastructure damage monetarily, ecosystem disruption is much more difficult to quantify. However, their impacts on the ecosystem can still be substantial. For example, eastern wild turkey is a popular game species in the United States that is currently on the decline in Alabama. While this is a multifaceted issue, wild pigs do display negative interactions with wild turkey, and this could be a piece to the puzzle in understanding these population declines. Some of these interactions that may have potential effects on wild turkey populations are competition, nest depredation, and adult predation. The greatest competitive effect between wild turkey and wild pigs likely comes from the exploitation of mass resources. Specifically in the Southeast, it's all about the acorns. Acorns are the masting fruit of an oak tree and are considered a pulse resource. A pulse resource is defined as a resource that is spatially and temporally limited. For acorns, this peak availability comes in the fall. And during this peak availability, acorns can comprise 20% of the diet of wild turkey and be up to 64% of a wild pig's diet. While this overlap of use between these two species is not as large as some other species like white-tailed deer, wild pigs' voracious feeding habits are still likely to have a competitive effect. Nest predation is a primary loss of eastern wild turkey nests in North America, and wild pigs fall into the myriad of nest predators of wild turkey. And in a recent study using artificial nests, wild pigs depredated 29% of mock turkey nests. And this was the most out of any other nest predator observed in this study. Similarly, the depredation of ground nests by wild pigs has been shown to be density dependent for both wild pig density and ground nest density. And this density dependent depredation effect for wild pig density has serious implications for my study, which does manipulate the density of wild pigs on my treatment sites. And it is very important to note that there are several limitations to the use of artificial nests for in the study that I just previously mentioned, and they cannot serve for the replacement of true turkey nests, but they do serve to provide valuable insight into the depredation rates and foraging activities of nest predators. Lastly, wild pigs have been observed predating adult eastern wild turkey. And these observations are few and far between, and there have been no studies conducted to directly measure this. Therefore, the extent of this predation is unknown, but likely minimal. Now that I've given a little bit of background into what I'm investigating, I wanted to discuss the goal of my research. So my goal is to determine if wild pigs are impacting wild turkey populations and to document what changes, if any, occur after wild pig removals. So my research involved using camera trap surveys to determine if wild pigs were affecting eastern wild turkey populations. And my study consisted of 3 parts: wild pig removals, wild turkey population monitoring, and modeling the changes to these removals. This was done as an experimental design in which wild pig population density was reduced on my study areas. And then next, I monitored wild turkey populations for any changes that may occur. To do this, I conducted a pre-removal baseline survey for 1 year prior to the beginning of the wild pig removals, as well as 2 years after they began. Trapping did continue throughout those 2 years on 3 of the sites, and then 1 site served as a control and did not receive any treatment over the 3-year study. I then classified these images and used this data in my N mixture models to determine if there was a response in the wild turkey population densities, as well as age and sex ratios within the population. First, I would like to describe the study areas that I conducted my research on. So all 4 sites are roughly between 2,500 and 5,500 hectares, and each site is approximately 25 kilometers apart. And these sites are all located in southeastern Alabama in the upper coastal plains ecoregion. And these properties are managed for both timber and game species such as white-tailed deer and upland game birds. And with the exception of treatment site 3, these study areas are over 50% forested land comprising pine, hardwood, and mixed forests. And these properties have the habitat and wild pig densities that are representative of the surrounding area. Wild pig removals began on May 1st, 2019, after 1 year of surveys to establish a baseline for the population density of eastern wild turkey. Trapping was the main method that wild pigs were removed by, and these removals were conducted by USDA APHIS Wildlife Services and continued for 22 months until March 20th, 2021. For trapping, both traditional and more advanced methods were employed. Trip lines and root sticks were used to allow pigs to trigger the traps themselves. Additionally, remote traps were employed that allowed the user to manually trigger the door to drop. And all the traps used were corral-style traps with a drop door. And I included a picture of this on the right here as an example. Helicopter gunning was also employed as a supplementary removal method to the trapping. And the goal of wild pig removals was complete eradication, but this proved to be a very difficult task. We did, however, drastically reduce the populations on these treatment sites. And as I previously mentioned, I used camera trap surveys in order to measure population demographics of wild turkey every year. The survey points for these surveys were established by overlaying a 1 square kilometer grid on my study areas. Then at the center of each grid, I created a 100-meter buffer zone to put the camera in the best spot to maximize detectability of wild turkey. Only grid cells that contain more than 75% of the study area were included in this design. I used these same points for all 3 years for consistency, and for the summer surveys, the entire site was used, whereas during the spring survey, there were only 20 randomly selected grid cells that were used. And I included an example of the camera locations from one of the summer surveys here on the left as a visual example. And at each camera point, prior to deploying the camera, I pre-baited each site for 1 week with 2 rounds of 11.3 kilograms of cracked corn, spaced roughly 3 to 4 days apart. And the goal of this pre-baiting period was to habituate animals in the area to a centralized feeding location, and then to keep bait on the ground and keep the animals coming back to this area. Then 7 days after the first bait deployment, I set up a Reconyx camera and placed another round of bait in front of the camera. Then 3 to 4 days later, I rebaited the site to keep bait on the ground in front of the camera. Each camera was active for 7 days before being collected, and the cameras were set to take a time-lapse photo every 4 minutes and the 3-round bursts of motion-activated pictures with a 3-minute rest period. And this was in order to maximize detection while still keeping the number of pictures to analyze realistic. I conducted camera surveys from the summer of 2018 until the spring of 2021. These surveys were conducted twice a year, once in the summer, aimed at targeting poults while they could still be discernible from adults, but their probability of survival was the greatest, and a spring survey to target adult male density prior to the hunting season in Alabama. The first year surveys were used to establish a baseline of wild turkey populations on my study sites prior to the wild pig removals. Wild pig removals began at the end of the spring baseline survey, or in between the end of the spring baseline survey and the beginning of the summer survey post-removal in 2019. After wild pig removals began, I conducted 2 years of surveys to monitor any changes in the wild turkey population to the wild pig removals. For my analysis, I classified each image by either having no turkeys, or if turkeys were present, I classified the age and sex per individual using the Time-Lapse 2 image analysis program developed by the University of Calgary. And the age classes I used were adult male, juvenile males, females, and poults. After these images were classified, I created a detection history for each site to use in my N-mixture models. These models use both the binary and Poisson distribution to calculate the density based on a given detection probability and encounter history. And I ran my models using package unmarked in R. And for each model, I used 1 hour bins. So basically there was a single detection history for each hour that made up the entire week-long survey. And each bin was aligned temporally across my camera sites. And this was to keep consistency. And for my models, I only included bins that fell within 1 hour prior to sunrise to 1 hour after sunset. And this was in order to provide a more realistic detection, as wild turkeys are roosting during the night and are therefore not available for detection on the ground. And in each bin, the maximum number of turkey recorded per sex and age class in an image was used. For example, if there was an image of 5 toms in a group and a group of 3 adult males in the same hour, this would have counted as a total of 5 detections. And as I mentioned, the wild pig removals were large scale. And while we did not remove every pig from our treatment areas, a large number of wild pigs were removed over the 22-month period. So a total of 1,851 wild pigs were removed from my treatment sites. Treatment site 1 had a total of 657 pigs removed. Treatment site 2 had a total of 879 wild pigs removed. And treatment site 3 had the lowest number of wild pigs removed at 315. So here I included a graph of detections for the summer surveys each year to give a simple visual representation of the increases that I'm seeing. And while these detections are only part of a model, it is a strong representation of the results that the model produced. So year 1 represents the pre-removal baseline surveys that were conducted. And as you can see, the detections of wild turkey at the control and treatment site 1 are relatively similar. Wild pig removals occurred between the year 1 surveys and the year 2 surveys. During the second year, or prior to the second year, approximately 360 wild pigs had been removed from treatment site 1. And we begin to see an increase in total turkey detections on treatment site 1, while these numbers remained relatively constant on the control. And the most drastic changes in detection numbers comes in year 3, when the detections on our control dropped or decreased, and they nearly doubled on treatment site 1. And this brings me to the results for my N-mixture model with the data that I have analyzed thus far. So the model shows that the variable for wild pig removals has an effect of 4.06 times increase in the total turkey density. And this is with 95% confidence limits of 1.10 and 14.92. And for my model, the removal of wild pigs was the most significant variable in the abundance of wild turkey, with a p-value of 0.04. I am also seeing an increase in poults on these treatment sites, with 0 detections prior to removals and numerous groups 2 years after the removals began. Again, wild pig removals began between year one and the year 2 surveys. However, year 2 did not see an increase in poult detection from the baseline. And this was likely due to the fact the timing of the removals was too late to have an impact on nest success. And the increase in total wild turkey seen in year 2 on the previous slide was from an increase in the adult age classes. So it is not until year 3 that there is a drastic increase in poult detection. Now, these data have not been modeled, and therefore I do not have any specific outputs from a model to give you, but I have included this as an anecdotal reference to the data that I am observing. And analyses from these data on other sites is still underway. However, so far I am seeing similar trends in the detection of pulse across the other treatment sites as well. And given that my research is very broad scale and simply serving to determine if removing wild pigs may have an effect on turkey populations, the mechanisms as to how these changes would occur cannot be determined from my study. So while this research may not directly examine the causes of this shift in turkey populations, previous research can give some insight and allow us to speculate some reasons why we may be seeing the changes that we are. So two main phenomenon that may be occurring here are increased reproductive output and a lessening of competitive and interference interactions. And as suggested in the literature, wild pig ground nest depredation is a function of wild pig density, as these animals do not seem to actively seek out nests, but rather depredate them opportunistically when they happen upon them. Therefore, with a reduction in wild pig density, there should be less nest depredation by wild pigs. With the competition and interference interactions, this potential mechanism is a twofold phenomenon. And with less wild pigs, there is likely more resources such as hard mass available for other species to consume. And with a greater availability of mass for wild turkey, the ability of the ecosystem to support wild turkeys in these areas would increase as this opens up an energy-rich resource to wild turkey. We can also say that given the increase in adult density of wild turkey after the initial removals, that these turkey likely migrated into the area as the poult numbers observed did not increase. Therefore, this increase was likely not from reproduction. It is possible that these adults migrated due to the reduced density of wild pigs compared to the surrounding areas. As I mentioned, these causes are speculation and therefore there are likely other unexplored mechanisms playing a role in these results. And this is an area of research that needs to be better explored in future studies in order to help us get the full picture and better understand these interactions between eastern wild turkey and invasive wild pigs. For my research, I would like to thank USDA-APHIS Wildlife Services for funding and assisting with the field activities associated with this research. I would also like to thank the landowners and land managers that helped allowed us to conduct this research on the properties. I would also like to thank Steve Zenas and Ariel Fay of Auburn University for assisting with field operations and providing images that were used in this presentation. I also wanted to include my email here in case anyone wanted to reach out with any questions or comments or to simply discuss the research in general. I also wanted to thank everyone for coming and listening to this presentation today. Thank you.